How's it going, home group leaders? Hey, this is the second video as we analyze narrative, the genre of narrative throughout the Bible. Again, these videos are intended to help home group leaders better facilitate conversation in their home the week prior to the sermon being preached. So remember, I'd say as you're looking for the basic plot arc within a narrative genre of Scripture, you're looking for setting, conflict, climax, resolution, new setting. The last video, we covered Exodus chapter 14, and I encourage you to look at that if you haven't already. This video, I'm going to start by just telling you that another narrative you could practice with is 1 Samuel 17, where, of course, you have the famous account of David and Goliath. Now, if you are, looking at 1 Samuel 17, then you're going to see the exact same principles come to pass. Setting, conflict, climax, resolution, new setting. Why don't you go ahead, take a moment in this video, pause it right now as we speak, see what verses you would assign to 1 Samuel 17. We're not going to spend as much time as we did in Exodus 14. We're not going to read it here in this video, but I just want to see if you can compare your answers with mine. Where would you place those verses within the plot arc? All right, now that you have paused the video, one thing that I just want to share is this. I would probably put the setting in 1 Samuel 17 in verses 1 through 7. You have the people of Israel camped on one side, the people of the Philistines camped on the other side, and then you're given massive descriptions about what Goliath is like. I would say there's no conflict yet. There is a battle, but it really hasn't heightened. It's not until you get to verse 8 where you see Goliath speak, and you see his perpetual threats made to the nation of Israel, his mockings, his tauntings, even his mocking of the God of Israel. You see all of this come to light. I think the conflict of 1 Samuel 17 starts in verse 8. The way Samuel, by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, has arranged that 17th chapter is I think he spends a lot of time on the conflict. I think the conflict goes from verse 8 all the way to verse 40. And so while the chapter may be 58 verses long, I think that the conflict goes from verse 8 all the way to verse 40. Notice that it starts with Goliath speaking, and then you see David. He's introduced to you, and we see that he's a shepherd boy. We see that Jesse sent him to the battlefield to check in on his brothers. Some would argue that the setting goes from verse 1 all the way to verse 15, just because you also get another introduction to David. I think it just might be intermingled in there. But the reason why I go from verse 8 to verse 40 with the conflict is because the perpetual problem is Goliath's mockings of the nation and mockings of Israel. That is the problem that has to be solved, which is why I start it in 8, I take it to 40. Then you see the rising conflict. David is asking all of these questions. Why has nobody gone out to the battlefield? Are you kidding me? He's mocking our God and not one of you has gotten out there. I think maybe the greatest conflict in the entire account is not just Goliath taunting the nation, but where is Saul? We so often think of David and Goliath in this account. We don't think of David, Goliath, and Saul. Notice that Saul, he was chosen to be king by the people because he was tall and he was handsome. He looked like a warrior king, but he was anything but that. And so why is Saul way off in the distance in his camp or in his tent? Why does David have to be ushered to Saul's tent? Why is Saul not on the battlefield? It's almost like 1 Samuel 14, God said, I found a man after my own heart. Saul, the kingdom's going to be taken from you. It's almost like this account shows us why the kingdom was taken from Saul. Because he had no courage. He had no leadership. He was not the one necessarily that was God's choice. He may have been anointed, but he wasn't God's choice. In 1 Samuel 16, we see that David was God's choice. This was his choice not to bring about a king right away, but to bring about a king slowly and to work on his life and to make him mature before he placed him into that role. And so you start to see this culminative event. The fake king is sitting in his tent, and the real king, who's already been anointed, he's the real king out on the battle line. And so I think this is quite amazing. David is asking questions. In fact, his own brother, says, I know your insolent heart. I know you have the worst of motives for being out here. Why don't you go back out to the pasture with your few sheep, if you were to read the account? So it's not just conflict between Goliath and the nation and conflict between God and Saul. It's also a familial conflict between David and his brothers. somewhat of a conflict between David and Saul, not between each other, but you see one who's willing and one who's unwilling. Okay, so I think that the conflict goes all the way to verse 40. I think the climax, just like in Exodus chapter 14, I think the climax of 1 Samuel 17 is verse 41 all the way to verse 51. The reason why I did that is because we go from a discussion, conversation, questioning, all the way to action. And as was stated in the last video, typically your climax is found when God is doing something or God is saying something. And so here we see God giving David this unreal strength where he's not afraid of what Goliath is saying. He just responds right back to him. And in fact, there are so many people who get this account wrong, and they preach it from the pulpit as, what is your Goliath? You know, if you trust the Lord, then your problems will be solved in life. Or what are your 5 smooth stones that you take from the brook? And there's all of these odd, like, metaphorical principles that we often make this text to become. I think the point is found in the climax itself. More often than not, the greatest emphasis of the text is in the climax. What does verse 46 and verse 47 say? You find a purpose statement. David says, I don't come to you with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. I think the whole purpose there is found in the words so that or that. Church family, anytime you see the word so, anytime you see the word that, or anytime you see the word so that, pay close attention, especially in narrative, because that's likely leading you to the main thrust of the entire passage. So I think David communicates the emphasis of the passage with his purpose statement in 46 and 47. Then you see David, he takes the stones and takes the sling. The stone hits Goliath into his forehead. It sinks into his forehead. He falls to the ground. David takes his sword, beheads him. I think that's the climax of the entire account. Then I would say that verse 52 to 54 is the resolution. Why? If the problem was they were unable to fight the Philistines before, now it's solved. Now they're chasing them down. They're pursuing them. They're killing Philistines. I even think David likely went on to continue to kill Philistines after he killed Goliath, although the chapter doesn't tell us. Why? Because if you were to look at 1 Samuel 18, you'd find that they come back home, and of course the people are chanting, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. So they pursue the Philistines. They give them a whipping, if you could say that, and the problem is solved. They weren't fighting, now they are fighting. So you go from conflict to resolution. What changed in between? What was the climax? What was the transition point? It was David and Goliath. And so that's how you find the resolution. It is the thing that caused the resolution. The climax causes the resolution, I should rather say. Okay, now this gets a little bit odd, but you just have to be discerning. I think the new setting, there is not always a new setting, but I think the new setting found in 1 Samuel 17 is verses 55 to 58. It's actually out of chronological order. You see David, again, in 55 to 58, he's running onto the battlefield, and Saul, after he gave David his armor, and David doesn't fit. By the way, what a coward, again, Saul is, for not just manning up and going out there himself in his rightful position. But as he's headed off without armor, and he's got this confidence in the Lord, Saul asks the question, who is this? It's almost like 1 Samuel 17 is not only telling you that God himself is going to bring about deliverance for Israel so that all the nations may know, verse 46 and 47. But it's also answering the question who God's royal chosen king is. And so Saul is asking the question, but the Bible has already shown you who this is. He was anointed by Samuel in 16, steps into the fight at 17. The new setting is, oh man, even the supposed king of Israel is coming to find that he's not God's choice. It's somebody else. So I think that's the new setting, because then you get to the next chapter, and of course, what does Saul want to do? There's a conflict in his soul and his spirit. He wants to kill David. Okay, so that would be 1 Samuel 17. Hope that makes sense. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. This is a shorter narrative account. It's also in the Gospels, which will benefit us because we're currently going through the book of Matthew. Let's just read this. Ask yourself how you would formulate the plot arc. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. and both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." By the way, that's about 75 to 113 liters. So they filled them up to the brim, and he said to them, "Draw some out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This, beginning of his signs, Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Okay, pause the clip right now. See where you would sign the verses for the plot arc. Setting, conflict, climax, resolution, new setting. All right, hope you had a chance to do that. Here are my answers. These are my justifications for why I would set things as so. Verses 1 and 2, I think you have the setting. They're at a wedding. Where are they at? Cana of Galilee. You see Jesus' mother. You see Jesus. You see his disciples. It's just giving you basic information that you need to know. Then I think the conflict goes from verse 3 all the way to verse 5. What's the conflict? The wine runs out. You could even say a softer conflict is Jesus' mother doesn't understand that his hour has not yet come to reveal himself as the Messiah. Jesus knows that. So nevertheless, she seems to just say, enough with that. Continue to go on. Whatever he tells you to do, do it. And so Jesus is reluctant, but his mother understands that he can do this. He can solve this problem. He can solve this conflict. And so I think the conflict is naturally verses 3 through 5. As we have said over and over again, typically, almost 99% of the time, what you find is that the climax always involves God doing or saying something. Well, here, the Son of God does do something, and he does say something. He speaks and he acts. And so he fills up the water pots, he turns them into wine. The head waiter tastes it, and it's incredible. And then the head waiter calls the bridegroom. I personally would place the climax in verses 6 through 9, maybe 6 through 8. Maybe I wouldn't carry it on to the head waiter, but I'm just thinking that he tastes the wine, he thinks that it's good. Verse 10, I would see as the resolution, the statement. Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine, but you have kept the good wine until now. Not only is this the best wine, but this is the best son. The Son of God has arrived on the scene. John opens with that. I think the conflict was you have no wine. The resolution is now you do have wine. Again, what is the transitional event that took you from problem to resolution? It's whatever Jesus did. That's the climax. So the resolution is now that they have the best wine at the end of the wedding. Now I think verse 11 is the new setting. This beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. What happens? Jesus is manifesting, the disciples are believing. That's going to thrust you on into the rest of the account of John. By the way, side note, there are 7 signs or 7 miracles in John's gospel. They're less about the miracle, and they're more about what the miracle is pointing to. What does it say? It says that it manifested his glory. This is him, the Son of God, revealing his glory to the world, slowly unveiling it. I also think it's ironic that the gospel would note that Jesus came to purchase the church with his own blood, Acts 20:28. And so it's interesting that the reason why Jesus came is to gather a church, a bride for himself, and then what do you see here? Well, you see him at a wedding, revealing his glory for the first time ever, chronologically speaking. So some things to note, but this is how I would formulate the natural plot arc. If I was in a home group setting, I would focus most on what Jesus is doing and saying. It's not that you can't find application elsewhere in those points, but you better find the thrust, you better find the emphasis. And I think finding the plot arc is just a good exercise in and of itself if you're in a home group setting. You don't have to have all the answers. You just got to know how to facilitate. You got to know how to agree or disagree, how to find your justifications for your answers, and then you find out on Sunday if you're right or wrong. So It takes practice. It takes time. You're not aiming for perfection, but you are aiming to grow in your understanding of the scriptures and how you interpret them. Okay, so hope these things help both from 1 Samuel 17 and in John chapter 2. God bless you, and look for the next video on discourse interpretation. God bless. Take care.